George Butler was born in the parish of All Saints, not this All Saints, but another All Saints church on the flat Lincolnshire Fens. He was the son of a farm labourer, Marshall Butler, and his wife Sophie Day. He was one of at least 10 children. When George was a baby, they came to this area, and they first lived in Burr Heath. As you drive down the Brighton Road, and you've gone past the Reigate Road junction, on your right, there are trees all the way down to Tadworth Court. In those days, the trees wouldn't have been there. There would have been open fields. There was a large field there called Copley's. And just on the edge of that field was a Victorian cottage, a Gothic cottage. And that's where the Butlers came to live. It still stands today. It's now numbers 2 and 4 Shelvers Way. It's a locally listed building. It looks like quite a grand affair, actually. And it may well have been enlarged quite a lot because it seems far too above their station, unless it was perhaps subdivided into smaller cottages. When George was quite young, the family came to Banstead, and they moved into one of the first few cottages being built in what had been a field called Little Diceland, which was soon to become Diceland Road, then probably still known as just New Road. They lived at number 7, one of a pair of semi-detached cottages that were called Sunnyside at the time. George grew up there. He went to school in the village, and then he married to Sarah Parsons, a domestic servant from Devon, in 1905. And they went on to have 3 children together, Aubrey, Clarence and Lena. Unfortunately, they lost Aubrey when he was a baby before he was baptised, but the other 2 children were baptised here at All Saints Church. And they made their home at number 7, Firtree Cottages, in Pound Road. The Firtree Cottages are no longer there. They went shortly after the Second World War. And there were 2 terraces of 4 brick-built cottages with a pair of weatherboard semi-detached cottages sandwiched in between them. And George and Sarah lived in the end of one of those brick terraces. George was one of the last volunteers before conscription came in, and he joined the army under the Derby scheme in May of 1916. The advantage of doing that, rather than waiting till conscription came in just a month later, was that he got to choose which unit he joined. He chose to join the Royal Engineers. He worked as a carter and then as a bricklayer, and bricklayers and other skilled tradesmen were needed for the field companies of the Royal Engineers, a unit of perhaps 200 men with a dozen or so or half a dozen men of various different trades, bricklayers, plumbers, electricians, all sorts that were needed to keep the machinery of war running on the Western Front. He'd also worked later on as a platelayer on the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, and it could be that he actually joined a railway company of the Royal Engineers. We simply don't know what happened to him for a year during his time with the Royal Engineers, but we do know that in the middle of September, he and about 150 other men were transferred from the Royal Engineers to the 18th Lancashire Fusiliers. They'd been fighting in the Third Battle of Ypres, this attempt to break out of Ypres that's commonly known as Passchendaele. The low-lying medieval market town of Ypres lay to the west, over there towards the back of the church. And they would have looked east, as you are doing today, towards high ground behind us here, just 3 or 4 miles away from the town. Up to your left, on top of a ridge, would be the village of Passchendaele. It was the original objective of the first 2 days of that battle. I mentioned earlier that was in its 82nd day, 100 years ago today. We were trying to take that high ground, break out to the plain beyond, cut the German lines of communication, and hopefully kick them out of Belgium and perhaps even win the war. They'd suffered bad casualties, and they needed men from the Royal Engineers and men from the inland waterways, regiments, all kinds of men that wouldn't perhaps have imagined that they would have a rifle in their hands and be serving on the front line, but found themselves pressed into service as auxiliary infantrymen. They trained for a couple of weeks in a rest camp. Most of those men, as I said, probably wouldn't have held a rifle for quite a long time. They would have been very rusty, and there would have been a lot of training to form them into a cohesive fighting unit. They came onto the battlefield on the 16th of October. They were stationed in the north of the battlefield, over this way, where it was quite flat. It was quite like the countryside where George had been born, actually, this waterlogged plain with a great big canal running through it. Further to the north, the Belgians had opened the floodgates, and they flooded the countryside for miles around to stop the Germans getting through. So it was right on the edge of the territory that was actually being contested during this battle. And just to the north was what remained of a forest, the Houtholst Forest. It had been untouched in the early stages of the battle, and so it hadn't been reduced necessarily to craters and matchsticks like the other woods in the battlefield had been. And so when the Guards Division had attacked there on 2 occasions in October, they'd actually been able to make some pretty good progress over ground that hadn't been destroyed, hadn't been flooded by the burst banks of streams. But that forest provided a lot of cover for the German defenders. They had lots of concrete emplacements built into the wood, they had lots of huts holding reserves of men, and it was an ideal point for the Germans to launch a counterattack into our vulnerable left or northern flank as we extended ourselves further and further away from our strong position towards the village of Passchendaele. And so before the next major assault was to go in at Passchendaele, we needed to deal with that whole forest for once and for all. And so 100 years ago today, at 5:45 in the morning, the men of George's brigade launched an attack on the south of the Holtholst Forest. George's battalion were in support, and in front of them were 2 other battalions of their brigade. On the left were the 17th Lancashire Fusiliers, on the right were the 23rd Manchesters. Their attack was going to form a fan shape. They were going to fan out from an 800-yard frontage to a 1,400-yard frontage. And as those first 2 battalions diverged, a gap would open up for George's battalion, the 18th Lancashire Fusiliers, to advance into. They advanced according to plan at first. The creeping barrage that was protecting them was moving forward 100 yards every 8 minutes. And the men, it was far too slow a pace for the men. They were very keen, very enthusiastic, and they kept running into their own barrage and having pulled back by their officers. But progress soon slowed down as they met more and more resistance. Something went wrong far away onto the right, and it left the 23rd Manchesters on the right of George's brigade in trouble with an exposed flank. And they started to get dragged off into this gap that was opening up on the right where there were no other British soldiers. And just as George's battalion were moving forward, coming up alongside them in the centre of this big fan shape, this other battalion on the right were getting dragged away from them. A gap was opening up between them. And right in that gap, dealt with by neither battalion, was a complex of German huts with at least 5 machine guns defending it. And they started to cause some very heavy casualties into the flanks of both of those battalions that were ignoring that position and going around it, as it were. So both of those battalions got pushed further and further away by these machine guns. And George's battalion got pushed off into the left and started mixing up with the 17th Lancashire Fusiliers on their side. Further away to their left, the other British troops had got stuck as well, and their left flank was exposed. So this whole brigade was just forming like a narrow salient sticking out from the line, very, very exposed and vulnerable to German counterattacks. The leading right company of George's battalion were sent into the woods. The tree stumps were maybe about this high. The ground was just littered with branches and bushes that had been destroyed by shell fire. It was very hard to move around. You couldn't really dig down into the ground to make any kind of shelter for yourself. It's a very dangerous place to be. Lots of German pillboxes in that area. And the men fought as best they could, fighting from tree to tree, from shell hole to shell hole. To their left, the left leading company of George's battalion were mixed up with the 17th Lancashire Fusiliers and helped them achieve their objectives of the day. As the exposed and vulnerable nature of their position became clear as the morning progressed, plans were made to pull the Fusiliers back to a more defensible position, which they then did. One of the most effective, or one of the most positive developments from our campaign at Passchendaele was we learned how to deal with German counterattacks very, very effectively. We decided not to advance too far, so we didn't lose too many men as we did. We consolidated our positions thoroughly when we reached them, and we had pre-planned barrages that would drop down on likely rendezvous and meeting points of the German troops, and also on the lines they'd use to approach us. So when in the afternoon those counterattacks did start coming in, a simple SOS signal at 4:03 from the Lancashire Fusiliers immediately brought down an intense barrage on the German troops that were streaming out of the forest towards them. The Fusiliers opened up with their rifles, their Lewis guns and the machine guns, and they completely stopped the German counterattack and drove them back into the safety of the forest. The men dug in shell holes as best they could, most of them having to lie waist deep in cold water, filling sandbags from the mud that was around them to make makeshift parapets for them, to make a line in which they could hold. It was extremely difficult getting wounded off the battlefield. The battlefield conditions were very, very muddy. Men would be exhausted after carrying wounded men for even short distances. They couldn't be got away from the battlefield, from the first aid points quickly enough, and they all gathered around these concrete bunkers. Unfortunately, they were right in the zone that the Germans were shelling at the time, and many wounded men were killed once they had actually been rescued from the battlefield. The Fusiliers suffered many casualties that day. George was one of them. He was 34 years old and left a widow and 2 young children. Thank you very much.
They should grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age will not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.
So may the blessing God Almighty, the Father, Son, and Holy